and the next thing I want to really emphasize most as kind of, I think, possibly the most important new kind of phenomenon that has the potential to really alter a lot of people's minds. This has to do with near-death experiences, particularly near-death experiences that occur under extreme physiological conditions, such as deep general anesthesia and or cardiac arrest. My colleague, Bruce Grayson at DOPS, he's probably the world's most important investigator of this whole subject. And he's got a book, by the way, coming out next spring that'll be called After, which tells the whole story of his involvement with this kind of work. He has about 1,000 cases in his collection, of which maybe 250 to 300 are of this type that occur under these extreme conditions. And the really important fact here is that, of course, general anesthesia is intended to prevent you from having experience, and cardiac arrest in particular rapidly suppresses physiological conditions that virtually every neuroscientist today thinks are necessary for the possibility of conscious experience. And yet, under those conditions, some people are not only having experiences, but having the most intense and transformative experiences of their entire lives. There are a bunch of recent cases that have been documented in detail. How do we know that they're actually having the experiences during the time of apparent unconsciousness? Well, because in some of the best cases, they report things correctly, it turns out, that happened during that period. And they always report after, never before. It's kind of a long, complicated story to defend the sort of natural interpretation against various alternatives, some of which include the possibility of paranormal involvement. Some of the things they report, by the way, include not only local happenings, but distant ones that can subsequently be verified and that would not have been available even if the patient had been fully awake in the normal way. I think these cases, I mean, we're finding more of them because we're getting better and better at retrieving people from the borderlands of death. I think you can count on the fact that we will see more and more cases of this type, some of which will be documented in great detail. One of the cases, by the way, that's of interest to us is that of Eben Alexander, who wrote this book, Proof of Heaven. Title was chosen by the publisher, not by Eben. And Eben is actually a subject in my lab. He's a good chap. And his 600 plus page medical record was read individually by Bruce Grayson and two medical associates, and they published a paper about it because it's been alleged in various quarters that maybe Eben wasn't really all that sick and so on and so forth. He had an 8-day coma induced by bacterial meningitis and had a recurring series of mystical experiences basically during that time. Let's see, then there are other chapters in the book about things like genius and mystical experiences. Both subjects very poorly handled in contemporary psychology, especially mystical experiences, which have been mostly ignored. And when dealt with at all by scientists, usually denigrated and pathologized. And one of our main conclusions in putting Irreducible Mind together was that particularly mystical experiences need and deserve much more scientific attention than they have received so far, because they really do seem to convey glimpses into different pictures of how reality is actually organized. Well, the long and short of all that was that we felt and argued that Irreducible Mind made a strong case against physicalism and for a different picture of how mind and brain normally work together. I'm speaking now as a psychologist. that mind and brain are to some degree functionally independent, that our everyday consciousness is a kind of, this is Myers now, is a kind of extract or adaptation to conditions of everyday life of an associated, more comprehensive mind and consciousness that often has much greater abilities and knowledge than the everyday personality itself. And that, again, is a characteristic of many of the best multiple personality cases. And so our experience is generated in association, normally, with a functioning brain, and conditioned by the operations of the brain. We're not saying that the brain has nothing to do with it, but that it's steering, conditioning the operations of this larger consciousness that potentially we all might have access to. And from a practical point of view, I think one of the most important corollaries of this picture is that we certainly can learn a good deal more about what conditions in the brain permit expression of these higher capacities. And I personally think the two most promising areas are psychedelic research and research on meditation, which of course is a traditional technique for gaining access to these kind of hidden potentials and so on. That's the kind of psychological side of things, but then we went on to that was a gigantic clerical task, basically. We then went on to the much harder task of trying to understand how the world might be constituted in order that the things cataloged in Irreducible Mind could happen. And that's had two stages now. The first book, Beyond Physicalism, we basically assessed 11 different systems that took the existence of all the phenomena cataloged in Irreducible Mind seriously and attempted to address that question. Well, how must things really be in order that this stuff can happen? And we didn't arrive at any final conclusions, but things were definitely headed in a sort of a central tendency. And I think I will end simply by saying how it looks to me at this moment. I mean, the central tendency is certainly toward some kind of idealistic theory. The ones that we were most interested in at the time of Beyond Physicalism all fall into the category of panentheisms. And Hyman, I have to say I was really interested in your presentation, which I understood very poorly. But for the first time, I realized, you said it explicitly, that Kabbalah is a panentheistic system. I wish we had had a chapter on it for Beyond Physicalism, and I will certainly read your book when it comes out. And, you know, the net situation for me is basically this. Like many people who get involved in psychical research from the scientific point of view, I became interested because I could see immediately that there are conflicts between things reported there and expectations derived from conventional scientific point of view. That's what makes it interesting. But I also hoped and expected really that some kind of minor fix somewhere would allow the science that I already knew and the kind of associated worldview to accommodate these additional things. Well, I've become less and less confident about that over the years, and slowly, grudgingly, have come to the view that once you abandon physicalism, as I described it earlier, and I think we're driven to do that by the amount and character of the available evidence against it, there's really no place to stop short of what's virtually its exact opposite, some kind of idealism or dual aspect monism, perhaps. And that's what our third book coming out next spring will be called Consciousness Unbound, Liberating Mind from the Tyranny of Materialism. Subtitle basically chosen as a kind of thumb in the eye of many of our colleagues.